You are listening to the Horse Radio Network, part of the Equine Network family.
Welcome to this episode of the Business of Practice podcast, where we focus on the physical, financial, and human sides of equine veterinary medicine. In this episode, we're talking about planning for 2023 with Dr. Mike Pownall. I'm your host, Kim Brown, publisher of Equine Management. Dr. Pownall, who is a DVM and an MBA, is a partner in McKee Pownall Equine Services in Canada and a partner in Oculus Insights. That company is focused on helping veterinarians and other members of the animal health care industry improve their businesses. Thank you, Dr. Pownall, for joining us today about planning for 2023.
Nothing like a big subject to talk about.
Yeah, well, no lack of things to talk about, that's for sure, because we know as the veterinary industry is still dealing with some of the fallout, and some good and some bad, from the global pandemic. The U.S. and other countries are facing some financial challenges. And while we might avoid a recession, there's still some money concerns among animal owners right now. So just in this big picture, what do you think are going to be the biggest challenges for equine veterinarians looking forward to 2023?
Well, I think you've touched upon a couple of them, and I'm just going to start everything and just say, this is my opinion. Anybody says they know for sure what's going to happen is a liar, because none of us know. So this is best educated judgment. So yeah, the economy for sure. Environmental concerns, I think we don't talk about them enough. And I still think the pervasive challenge we're going to have is with our people power. The veterinarian support staff, what have you. So, and then I think on the end of that, and we still have to look at it, and we start looking at what's happening overseas in other areas, is still the concerns people have for the use of horses in competition, racing, what have you. So I think those are the big four. I mean, of course, I guess if you can go down to more like specific geographic regions, some may be more important than the other, and there may be some other macroeconomic things going on there. But I think those are the big four that we could probably talk about.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about economics, because actually the pandemic for the U.S. vets, and I think for your Canadian vets as well, it seemed to actually have a fairly positive end-of-year effect for the last 2 years, based on the surveys that we've seen from Equine Management and from AVMA on the income that vets have. So we've got some economics on that. However, we've had supply chain issues. Along with that increased demand for vet services have come the fact that we can't get equine veterinarians in to fill in for, the ones that are retiring or the ones that are leaving for other practice. So when we talk about the economics, let's look at a couple of the top things. Veterinarian staff, salaries. I mean, what do you think that veterinarians need to be thinking about?
So number one is, we're living in inflationary times. We've been pretty smooth sailing for the last 13 or so years. But inflation is there, and it's going to persist for a while. I mean, any long-term forecasts that I'm seeing in North America is that inflation will start to taper down towards the end of 2023. A lot of what the Federal Reserve is doing is hopefully going to tamper down some inflation, but there's a lot of other things going on. I mean, the war in Ukraine, huge influence, things beyond our control. The price of fuel, things beyond our control. And so those things are all inflationary pressures. I was just reading an article. I mean, the price of lettuce that we're paying for in Canada is pretty well tripled since the same time last year. And the reason is because where most of lettuce is grown in the fall is in the Central Valley of California, and they have a drought, they have heat wave, and that kind of food pricing is up. I mean, as an aside, restaurants in our area are a lot of them are starting to cut back serving on salads and what have you because they're so expensive. So, but these are things that are beyond our control. It's like, but we, if we know they're coming, how do we deal with it? So, number one, our biggest challenge is twofold. One is we've got to pay our staff what they deserve. We have great staff, particularly veterinarians. They're not, they're not minting those out every day. And so we have great vets. We have to take care of them. And part of taking care of them is paying them appropriately. And to be able to afford to pay them appropriately is we have to make sure we're charging appropriately. And so there's always that challenge we have as veterinarians, like, oh, my clients won't accept that big pay increase or fee increase. But yet, if we can't keep up with inflation, we're actually further behind. So I think it's having the courage and the frank sense of reality that it's inevitable. We have to do it. And so, at least keeping up with inflation, if not trying to get a bit above it. So I think that's number one is we got to keep up with our fees. And then one of the things we are always worried about is recessions, which is, a contributing factor is a decrease in confidence in businesses, but also in the consumers and how they spend. And particularly in the United States, so much of your economy is consumer driven, as opposed to, let's say, in Canada or in Europe, where there's more government spending. And so in the United States, when consumers are not confident, they may say, well, let's start saving for a rainy day, or what do we really need to spend money on? And the reality is much of us in the horse industry, it's discretionary spending. And there's a lot competing against what people want to spend their money on versus, do they want to buy a new saddle or a new saddle pad or try different feeds? Or, do they go to a shoeing cycle every 6 weeks instead of every 5 weeks? Do we hold off getting our teeth floated this year? And so these are the decisions that people are going to be wrestling with. And that definitely affects us. So and one of the things that they talk about that in any business education, and there's a lot of articles happening about that now, is people say, well, it's a recession, we've got to cut, got to tighten our belt, we've got to cut off any excess, and the first thing that goes is the marketing budget. And the reality is the last thing that should go is the marketing budget, because this is the time where you can position yourself, because all your competition is most likely cutting their marketing budget. So this is when we need to invest in training our clients on the value of, let's say, annual dentistry, of their annual vaccines, of, wellness exams, what have you, and that these are things that, if left unattended, may end up being more expensive. So I think this is, a bigger emphasis is on client education, marketing, why we are valuable. That's a key part of it. So we can, maintain the health of our patients and keep our businesses on a good, solid foundation.
The Business of Practice podcast is brought to you by CareCredit. CareCredit keeps equine veterinarians at the heart of care by providing horse owners with simple, budget-friendly financing options. By bridging the gap between cost and care, CareCredit supports healthy financial relationships between veterinarians and their clients. It can help them move forward with care a horse needs whenever and wherever it's needed. So, as veterinarians looking to plan, and hopefully they are already working on their budgets and their marketing plans for 2023, what are some of the top things that veterinarians should be looking at now to prepare their practices for 2023?
Well, there's a lot of big unknowns. And so I'm in the process myself, finalizing our budget for the year. And it's a lot of decision of looking at things item by item, nice to have, need to have. And it's almost that binary kind of choice. But at the same time, you don't want, if you're investing in the future, so like you've invested in a new service, for example, and it's showing some interest. Maybe it hasn't shown the interest that you're hoping to. rather than saying, you know what, it's not doing much, it's costing us money, let's get rid of it. Whereas, you know what, it maybe needs more runway to develop. So one of the things we don't want to do is to financially starve some of the projects that we have that we're hoping that are going to bear fruit in a year or two. Now, of course, these are the times when you look at where are we losing money? Are there things that we're not making money on? And yes, those are the things you may have to make those hard choices, like, you know what? We don't need that. And so, you know, a nice to have to a need to have. Do we need 2 interns, or is 1 intern enough? You know, are there certain types of patients or services that we offer that we'd like to do, but boy, they're a drain on our resources, and maybe we're not going to do that. So I think, you know, it's really having that kind of cold analytic look at your practice, and just, which I think we need to do anyhow as businesses, is just, you know, hey, times are great, let's just carry on. But you know what? There are always times to look at what we have as a business going, you know what? Yeah, we're probably a little bit too lax on how we're managing these expenses. Or at the same time, you know, is there an opportunity to, you know, really emphasize a service that's growing? You know, I talked to a number of vets, and, you know, there are some of the complementary services, and their advanced dentistry is really growing. So, you know what? Go for that. And so I think it all comes down to knowing your clients, knowing your economics of your area. You know, we're lucky where I'm at in the Greater Toronto area. It's a very broadly distributed economy. It would take a huge impact for us to really notice a downturn. That's saying there are maybe certain segments within our client base that may be more affected than others. But I know if you drive an hour and a half outside of Toronto, there will be some areas that will, if there's a recession, they'll get impacted. You know, they're maybe depending more on manufacturing, for example, and that may go down a bit. So every situation is unique, and I think we sort of need to have this sort of bigger view of what's going to happen to our economy. What does the economy depend upon in our area? You know, what are some of the environmental concerns that may be happening? You know, I think we saw enough. I think we're all sick of seeing the stories of horses and floods and fires and drought and what have you, but that's becoming more and more of our reality. We better be aware of that.
Yeah, that's really true. And you mentioned something that may have scared the listeners more than anything else. I'm almost finished with my 2023 budget, and I will guarantee you there's a lot of our listeners that haven't even looked at their 2022 budget to see how their year has turned out, much less started on 23. So give us some encouragement that it's not too late. You can look at your numbers from this year and from years past, and you can get on track now for 23.
Absolutely. I mean, I look at my budget as sort of like looking at blood work for a patient, and it's a progress. It's going to be some, you know, depending on treatments and depending on what you do, it could look better or for worse. Yeah, I'm just ahead of the curve. I'm just a bit of a geek that way. But I like to plan, and I know just because the volatility that is our times now and what's going to happen in 2023, I want to be prepared because I'm making some decisions, and I've got to make sure I'm making the right decision. So, hey, I to be honest, I didn't finish my budget in 2022 until February. So it's a little bit of shame on me, and that's probably why I'm a bit ahead of the game. So yeah, a late budget is much better than no budget at all.
That is really true, Dr. Pownall. So is there anything else that you would recommend that veterinarians should do before the end of the year to get ready for 23 as far as their practice business is concerned?
You know what? We do not have a business without the people that we are there. And so one of the things I recommend is just doing some check-ins with your staff, very informal check-in meetings. You know, we talk about having exit interviews when somebody leaves a business. Well, by that time, the horse has already left the barn. Let's check in with people now. Understand what some of their concerns are. Why are they worried? You know, what are they worried about? What are their concerns? So, It's showing that you care about your staff, which goes a long way, but it helps you understand as a practice owner what you need to be aware of. Understanding from your staff what's making them come to work every day, helping you understand, do you have that good work environment? I mean, these will be challenging times. Nobody knows how challenging. But when you have your team all on the same page and they know that they're working with a team and that they have leaders that are supportive of them, you can get through a lot more than those that are just sort of going, I'm just waiting for the next opportunity and I'm bailing ship. And, none of us like to replace any staff members. So that's, again, like a budget, checking with your people, sort of get a bit of a measure of just how people are doing and what things you may do or be able to do to help them out.
And that's a really good point, because I know quite a few vets, techs, office staff who have been in those positions. And I don't think the practice leadership actually knows how dissatisfied they are, and that, exactly like you said, they're just waiting for the next opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, so it's been a bit of an up and down roller coaster in terms of, employment, and the economy is great. And I think, if you're looking earlier in this year, latter part of last year, there was a lot of, people leaving and going to new jobs, starting off on their own. Well, I think signs of a recession are going to make people stay closer to home. But the one thing we know about a recession is they end. And on average, they come about every 7 years and they last about a year to a year and a half. So they end. And so I think that's a bit of an optimistic sense that it's something that we go through, and we have gone through them in the past. I think over the last few years, we've sort of been feeling that we're immune to recessions because, we had the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. And since then, it's, we've gone about 12 years, like we're overdue, we're just overdue. But we will get through it. But you want to have a great team, because when things do turn around, and the turnaround is probably beginning of 2024 from any kind of projections I've looked at, well, if you've got a good team, they're going to stick with you because you don't want to get through this and all of a sudden your team leaves just because they didn't like where they're working. So I always come back trying to do whatever you can to keep your staff as happy as possible. Because without them, you don't have a business.
That's a really good point, Dr. Pownall. Well, we're going to thank everybody for joining us today on The Business of Practice, and a big thank you to Dr. Pownall for joining us, and a big thank you to CareCredit for sponsoring the Business of Practice podcast. And we invite you to visit equimanagement.com or your favorite podcast network to hear past episodes of The Business of Practice. And if you have any questions or suggestions, send an email to me at kbrown, that's the letter K Brown, at equinenetwork.com. The Business of Practice podcast is a production of the Equine Podcast Network, an entity of the Equine Network, LLC.